welcome to our webinar, and where we're going to deal with all things finance pertaining to COVID-19. And I'm delighted to be joined again by David Breen, Aidan McAvinue, and Ger Foley, and thank them for taking time from their busy schedule to come back and guide us again. I suppose things have moved on quite a bit since David, Aidan, and Ger spoke at what was at the time one of our first webinars. So I'm sure you'll have plenty of questions, and please feel free to submit them via the chat box. We already have a few questions, so we might get right into it. First, Aidan, you might give us an overview as to where we're at now in terms of COVID supports compared to the last time we spoke.
The COVID supports, well, specifically with the COVID supports, where we're at now is that the wage subsidy scheme has gone through a multiple of minor changes and tweaks from when we spoke. It was 2 months ago initially when we ran this seminar, and at that stage we had literally got the legislation just published, and there was in reality a lot of confusion out there as to how to actually apply the detail of the income support that was the wages subsidy scheme. In terms of the other schemes that were there, the illness supports, the pandemic unemployment support that's there, that hasn't changed. They have basically been fixed since we last spoke. Although what is now happening is that you are seeing some people starting to come off the unemployment benefit and back onto the wages subsidy scheme as businesses are restarting. So there's a little bit of evolution happening more than anything else. But the main change probably in the wages support scheme was that they allowed for lower income earners to bring the 70% support up to an 85% level. And then they also allowed people who had an income of maybe less than 350 euros a week on average within the scheme to be brought up to a 350 euros average. So breaking the rules slightly to in case people were working a bit more, but the scheme was actually restricting their ability to earn. So that's where it's kind of moved on from in terms of what's there. There is still confusion out there, and I think that's probably part of what's precipitating the seminar today, because people are still finding the scheme quite difficult to operate in certain scenarios.
And so your advice would obviously be to contact your local financial advisor, because it is a bit of a minefield out there.
Well, my advice at the minute would absolutely be that, from the point of view that if the guidance isn't helping you at the minute, then you have particular circumstances, which means you probably need to actually work through the details of the individual case that's arising, because the software has evaluated quite well. So for most people, their payroll software is handling the majority of the circumstances they have to deal with. So those oddball cases that are still arising. And we believe there will be more. There seems to be pressure on now to bring people who are on maternity leave in January, February, and have come back, to bring them within the scheme over the next couple of weeks. So we will see further evolution of it. And we do know that there is a political intention to extend the scheme. We just have no idea who and how that is going to benefit people going forward after what is essentially after the middle of June. You know?
And just on that whole kind of issue, the unemployment subsidy scheme for companies that will be returning, and I suppose the type of business that it certainly in the tourism hospitality, some of these businesses might struggle to re-engage with the people that they have put on the unemployment subsidy. What are there any supports for these businesses that won't be able to re-engage with these employees? Ger, would you want to handle that, or do you have any views?
Yeah, I suppose there's a restart grant that is going to be available from this Friday. The grant will be between 2,000 and 10,000 euro, linked to your 2019 rates bill. To a minimum of 2,000 euro to a maximum of 10,000 euro. And that's going to be for businesses with turnover of up to 5 million and 50 employees. So that will give a straight cash injection. The application process will be through the local authority, or your local authority. And I suppose that the timeline of how quickly they'll be able to process those applications is unknown as yet, because that will really depend on the influx of applications they get on Friday. But they are going to prioritise it in a way that links to the phased reopening plan. So the sectors that are reopening will be given priority there, hopefully. the criteria, the other criteria for that are that your business had to have been closed or been impacted by 25% reduction in turnover. So very similar to the eligibility criteria for the wage subsidy scheme. So that's one straight injection of potential grant money that will be there for a business, but it's probably still not enough for most SMEs in that it's capped at €10,000.
Mm. And Ger, just on that issue of potential redundancy then for some employees, which obviously is inevitable. Do you envisage any supports from government?
Yeah, and one of the issues even with the Restart grant is that there is a declaration, and again the exact steps of how that's going to work, how this is going to work is unclear, but there is a declaration that would be needed as part of that. One, that you will retain employees that you have already on the subsidy scheme, and that two, you will redeploy where possible or where practical employees that have been let go and are on the pandemic unemployment payment. So, you know, that in itself is maybe putting a little bit too much quite difficult for employers to actually self-declare in that respect. So I suppose we have to wait to see exactly what that application process will be like. But redundancies, I suppose, are going to be inevitable over the summer months and later into the year. The emergency legislation that was passed dealt with the short-term layoff to a certain extent, in that it extended the period whereby employers could short-term lay off people without having to make a decision on redundancy. But that is now going to become an issue for those businesses that, as they look at their new projections and their new financial plan going forward, don't have the scope or the headroom for the same level of team that they would have had pre-COVID. So that is going to be an issue.
Okay, thanks for that. And just to remind our visitors that that if you have any questions, please feel free to submit them via the chat box there, and I'll address it to our panelists. David, can I come on to you then? Just to talk us through what businesses should be looking at now in terms of reopening and their financial planning for the remainder of the year.
Good afternoon, everybody. First of all, everyone should recognise there are difficult challenges ahead for every business in reopening. It was easier to close than reopen, and people are faced with the fear. They don't know what their turnover is going to be. They've got the reopening costs in terms of protecting their staff, protecting the customer. Aside from the cost, they've got the logistics of it. And there is an air of uncertainty, and we're going into new territory. So I think the most important thing is for business owners, get your head into the space as where were you when you started off your business first, because that's effectively what you're doing again. So think, how did I get my business up and running? What was my mindset when I was up and running? Because if you don't have that positive attitude that you did have when you started the business, you're going to find it very difficult. There will be obstacles. You won't get it all right. You won't get it all 100%. There's no 100% correct answer in all of this. So what you're doing is you're going forward in baby steps. So my advice is you start off in steps, and what you try and do is you anticipate what level of turnover is going to be coming at you. You anticipate what level of staffing you're going to have to be available to meet that turnover. The advantage you have that if you open sooner is you will be able to avail of the wages subsidy scheme. And it's not a case of having cheap labor. It's a question of having staff available while your turnover is rising. And for those who wait or don't have to wait until after June, or as Aidan said, there's uncertainty as to when if the scheme is going to be extended or in what form it's going to be extended. We can only work on what we have at the moment. So you work out and you say, look, I'm going to go ahead, try and reopen if I'm permitted to do so from a health and safety basis. Try and control the costs and monitor them carefully. But the one advantage we do have is there is a wages subsidy there for at least the next 6 weeks, and hopefully there will be a clear intention soon as to what way that is going to carry on. I think it's essential retail get it. I think it's essential restaurants, pubs, all get it for when they open. At a minimum, they really need it to get their business up and running. So really get your head into the mindset, how did I start off this business? Because that's what you need to be doing again. If you did it before, you can do it again.
Yeah, that's great, because we've had a lot of questions from people around the whole wage subsidy scheme and how long it will last, and that it's one of the biggest deciding factors on reopening their businesses. So that advice is most welcome.
I think you have to work on the basis, Gerald, that it will be extended, and make that assumption. Because if we delay any longer, you won't have the benefit of the 6 weeks that are ahead of us.
Okay. No, thanks for that. And another question that has just come in, excuse me, does the reopening grant, does it apply to people working from their garden shed where no rates apply?
The short answer to that would be no. One of the criteria is you need to be on the rate payment system, and that's what the guidance currently says on it. So if you're not on the rate payment system, my view on it would be that you're not going to be eligible.
Yeah. No, that's fine. I've had another one here, and it's to all the panelists. If the application form available, or is the application form available now for the Restart grant, and where is it available from?
The answer is it's not available. The application's only open on Friday. None of us have seen the form yet, but we understand it will be available from the local enterprise offices' websites, which can be accessed through the council websites. So the easiest place to go is the front page of the council websites right across the country, whatever county council you're dealing in, because it will be relevant to where you're actually paying your rates. So you could have a business in Waterford, but you might have a premises as well in Dublin, as an example. So you might be in a position where you'd have two premises and you could be applying for two grants in two different councils. So the process will be managed by the enterprise boards and but dealt with ultimately through the rates offices in the councils.
Okay, thanks for that. And another one in here from West Waterford, in fact, if you have retained 80% of your staff and comply with the other criterias, but you can't re-engage the staff you put on temporary layoff, does that preclude you from the grant?
So I suppose the fact that there isn't an application form at the moment, our visibility on this is quite limited. But what the guidance has said to date is that you need to give a commitment that you will redeploy laid off staff if practical.
Mm-hmm.
Or so what I suppose we'll have to wait to see what exactly the self-declaration looks like around that.
Yeah. And actually, there's another one which is quite local. And David, if you want to handle this one, if rates are not fully paid last year, can you apply, or is that still a little bit unknown?
I think the idiosyncrasy of the scheme will become aware when you get into it. With the revenue subsidy scheme, there was an assumption that you were compliant with revenue and your returns were all up to date in terms of, for example, when revenue were parking their VAT, POE and PRSI, it was on the basis that the returns were online. So I would suspect that if there's compliance, unless the guys know any different, that they would expect compliance and it would be up to date, or else they would try and take it back and set it off against the arrears of rates.
Yeah. Okay. Look, that's everything. All right. Sorry, hold on 1 second. Now I think we have something else coming here. Sorry, we do have. If turnover increases beyond expectations, i.e. because of finding new customers or developing new products, and is no longer decreased by 25% or more because of COVID-19, even though the projections were that it would, should I stop claiming the COVID-19 wage subsidy? Could I ask Aidan that one?
The answer is that the expectation is that you would, but the reality is that for most businesses, if they suddenly get an order, for example, now, they may not get the cash for that until July or August. So, depending on your credit terms and exactly where you're at, I wouldn't say that it follows across the board that you automatically fall out of the scheme. So I think you'd need to look at the particular circumstances. Like I'm trying to think that there aren't that many businesses around which will have a massive cash windfall in the month of May or June, based on the economic circumstances that I'm looking out the window at, So I think you'd need to look at where things are at. I am aware of the likes of manufacturing businesses that are under pressure because they're suddenly finding they're getting orders. They didn't think they'd be getting orders, but because their competitors, for example, are in Germany and they're open, there's an expectation that, you know, they will deliver those orders to the customers abroad. So they're being forced to open, but they're probably operating their credit terms and need the cash flow of the wages subsidy scheme just to get them through that restart period as they're going. I think the spirit of the scheme is that that type of a company would continue to qualify.
Okay.
Just add on there as well is that I think we all, as hard as it is, we all need to try and put ourselves in the headspace we were back in April. Everyone was thinking a lot different in terms of where their business was going to go. So what is important is that when they elected for the wages subsidy scheme, that they documented why they thought their turnover was going to drop by 25%. So in a scenario, and that should have been documented at the time, because it was an election, and in that election for the subsidy scheme, it said, I anticipate my turnover is going to be reduced. So, you know, some businesses, their turnover will not meet the criteria. But I think if they did, it's important that they have a record as why they thought they would have qualified for the subsidy scheme at the time they made that election. That would certainly give them protection.
Okay.
And the revenue guidance on that said, I think both Aidan and David agree, it actually says that if your turnover, the eligibility improves, so that if your turnover transpires that it hasn't decreased by 25%, revenue will look for the rationale that you applied when entering the scheme. So to David's point of having that documentation together is important.
Okay, and Gerald, just as you're on, this one might be a little bit. I'd imagine some of your own customers that certainly be relevant to them. As an employer of seasonal workers who are not on our books in March, is the wage subsidy available to them when we re-employ in the next few weeks?
Yeah, so the eligibility for the eligible employees, unfortunately, looks back to January and February. So it's being on the books on the 29th of February was the key date for an eligible employee. So I'm assuming by the fact that they weren't in this case, that they weren't on the books in March, they also weren't on the books in January or February, in which case those employees wouldn't be eligible employees for the subsidy scheme. So I suppose the criteria were that you had to be in employment at the 29th of February, and the employer had to have the associated returns done by the end of March for the February period. So in that case, unfortunately, no, they wouldn't be eligible for the subsidy scheme, unless, of course, there's a change to how the scheme is done when it's hopefully reinvented in a few weeks' time and extended.
That's great, thank you. And maybe one for you here, David. For the wage subsidy, can I re-employ my manager now and get the subsidy when the remainder nearer opening time?
Yes.
Very straightforward.
Yeah. And just on some of the rehiring, there were some issues around rehiring and how people had treated when they were laying them off their payroll and bringing them back on the payroll. I think Revenue have addressed all of those issues, and there's no issue with rehiring, but there was anomalies, I suppose, with how people had been dealt with on payroll systems. In that Revenue had, if people had put in cessation dates on their payroll, there was the potential that those employees were no longer on what was called a CSV file that was released on the 4th of May as we moved into the operational phase of the scheme. So as a result, some people may not have got the subsidy for those people when they were rehired.
Okay, just on that CSV file, so what's happened, what Ger is referring to is that on the 4th of May, the Revenue gave an instruction to each employer via a payroll file. They have to download it from Ross in terms of the workings of the subsidy scheme. So it gave more clarity to the payroll systems and to the employers as to what they could and would pay and still work within the scheme. It's important, there's two things important when people come back to work. That number one, the employee signs off from the social welfare, okay? And the second one is that the employer draws down the file from the Revenue website. It's not enough to draw down that CSV file once. If there's a change, the Revenue currently do not notify you. So that file should be drawn down every week one does the wages, because there's critical information there that ensures that you are complying with the scheme. And if there's a fallback over someone not signing off to social welfare, or if there's a fallback over the scheme not being operated properly, then we all know whose pocket is going to fall back on. So just care does need to be taken in the operation of the scheme. And for the time being, draw down that file every single week you're processing payroll.
My understanding is exactly the same, but I think the logic of what they're trying to do is to say, if you're, and the example is good, taking back on the manager in a bar or a hotel to get it moving, what they're saying is that if you put that person through the payroll for nil pay the previous week to taking them back on before a Friday night, they will update that .csv file over the weekend, and it'll be available the following week. And that person should be on it with their subsidy amounts available if they qualify for the following week's payroll. So that's what the guidance is kind of telling us to do. So it's a point of detail that you do need to follow the guidance on. So it's one of those questions that is important to talk to whoever's doing your payroll or talk to your accountant to make sure you go through the steps correctly.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Aidan. And just before we, or sorry, do we always have one more coming in. And for the wage subsidy, can I re-employ? No, that's been there already, but sorry a second now. Does revenue pay the subsidy promptly? Does anyone have any views on that? Aidan, do you want to cover that?
Promptly, I mean, literally 24 or 48 hours, it's in the bank account. Yeah, it's very, I mean, I don't think, I have no experience of it being slow at all.
Okay, so just on that point, to add on to it, if Aidan's right, the revenue do pay the following day, so that's another yes. But if you don't receive it, well then the following day or within 2 days, you need to go back to revenue and check why you haven't received it. So number one, did you make the election for the subsidy scheme? Number two, did you give them the bank account details to refund the monies to? If you haven't received that refund, there is an issue and you need to follow it up and understand why. It's not like VAT refunds when you could be waiting 5 or 6 weeks and there's a query. If you don't get that refund straight away, you need to act on it and find out why you haven't received it.
Okay, well, thanks very much for that. If I was to ask each one of you just for one piece of advice which you could give our visitors here today, what would it be? Ger, can I just start with you?
I think it would be as you look to reopening, to really assess what your costs are going to be as best as possible. Yeah, your business has fixed costs, so you know, there was a question I think earlier about, is it worth my while opening my business? I think you've got to assess how much it's actually going to cost you to turn the key on the business. So while you are incurring a certain amount of cost, the minute you open it, you're going to incur more. And you've got to ask, you've got to set yourself a target as to what the revenue needs to be to try and cover those costs as best you can. And then I think that needs to be monitored as best as possible on a weekly basis. You do have to try and assess what your break even is, and ultimately try and get your revenue target back as close as possible to the break even. There's businesses that obviously came into this pandemic with good, strong reserves as well. And those businesses could easily have reserves eroded because their cash position might be stronger than other businesses. So I think every business needs to be as sharp as possible on their costs, and they need to monitor their performance on a weekly basis. So I think it's to David's point, it's get your head in the game as to what it was like when you started the business. Document everything on paper and monitor it as closely as possible on a weekly basis.
Fine, and actually, it's just listening to you there. It's some of the questions that came into us. It's kind of a backstory as well, and I'll just read out one of them. I'm very worried about reopening my hotel, bar, restaurant business, especially with all the difficulties we'll experience financially to reopen. My biggest concern is, will it pay us to open with extra staff costs and social distancing, therefore fewer customers, guests, but more staff to implement the restrictions? I was delighted to see a restart grant will be available, payable through our local councils. This will be much appreciated with all the extra costs we're incurring, with the cost of signage, shields and reception, staff training, staff PPI, disposable menus, etc., and of course the cost of restocking. By the time we open fully, our summer season will almost be over. So it will be viable to stay open. So will it be viable to stay open for the winter months? I've been in business since June 1968. 52 years. And this is the first time I've closed our business. And it's the first time I'm worried for my staff that I may not be able to stay open for the winter months, right? So, I mean, that's very much the story of where we are at the moment. David, just on that, is there any nugget of advice that you would like to part this on?
I understand entirely where that person is coming from. Very hard to get going again. Just reiterate, get your head in the space, what it was like all those years ago. Secondly, you're asking the question, is it going to be worth your while? I think at best, if you can get the business back up and running in the current climate and it's cash flow neutral, you'll be doing very well. Any expectation above that, or any expectation whereby you're going to be making profits or significant profits, that would be a lot to hope for in the current climate. But if you can get going, it's better for your staff, it's better for the economy, it's better for yourself. The longer it goes on, the harder it is to start. So all I can say is I understand it's difficult, particularly for seasonal businesses. They've been waiting all the winter for the summer. The guys in Dunmore, Tramore, they've been waiting all winter for the summer to start off again. And this is what they're faced with. You know, by the time they reopen, it will be time to close down. So it's very difficult. You have to motivate yourself. You have to look at the positive side and just do your best, rely on people around you, and just get encouragement for your staff. You're doing it for Brand Waterford. You're doing it for your staff. We're all in this together. You are not alone. So keep trying and keep going.
And just as a follow-on to that, David, I think now more than ever, I mean, we're constantly banging the drum about support local, shop local, do anything you can to support local businesses and so on. And I suppose the message, I think, should be sent loud and clear to everyone in business in Waterford, and people, and it's not people, the whole community of Waterford. For Waterford to recover from this, it's absolutely so important that they support one another financially and do shop locally at every single opportunity.
Now more important than ever.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Aidan, can we have the last word from you?
Could I just, Aidan, before you go back there, could I just raise one issue that's people were considering on? Sorry to cut across you there. Just in regard to the wages subsidy, I have a sense it's going to cause, for employees when they receive their payslip and they see the subsidy is there, employers, for those who are listening, be mindful of how employees feel when they get that. They don't see the side where turnover is dropping. They don't see the difficulties of the business. They don't see the cash flow vacuum. So I think communication with your employees, if you were putting them on the wages subsidy, I think that's critical. But also understanding what their frame of mind might be. There's been a lot of negative press to employees. Oh, you're going to have a tax bill at the end of it. It's not uncertain as the level of the timing of that tax bill. Okay, so I think that while employers are doing really well, working hard to keep their businesses open and taking a risk in doing so, they equally have to bring their employees on board and make sure that the wages subsidy scheme, as good as it is and as important it is, it doesn't cause a fracture between the employer and the employee, because all they're looking at is, oh, look at the subsidy, sure, look, that's all it's costing me. They need to motivate their employees and they need to bring them on board, because that's a critical part in getting forward again.
Okay, okay.
Sorry, Aidan.
Okay, sorry, Aidan, over to you.
Okay, well, I'm going to go back and reflect a little bit differently on what was described as the hotel bar business. I mean, to me, you're describing buildings. And I actually don't totally subscribe to the logic of go back to the way you were when you started your business, because you have to go back to the way you started now in the environment we're in now. And the reality is, for the likes of, you know, a hotel bar business, they're not in the hotel bar business. They're in the business of providing food, accommodation, managing events. So we've all the takeaways that have suddenly popped up left, right and center, with lots of good ingenuity and services being provided. So I think businesses need to take a little bit of a step back and say, what are we looking for here? And, you know, if I was to try and stay in a hotel in Dublin, for example, in September, what am I going to be looking for? I'm going to be looking for a safe place, one that if, for example, I have to eat in my room, that I actually have a wow factor. I'm not sitting on the dressing table, or if I'm trying to watch the telly with a tray on the bed. So providing the actual service in the environment that we're now in. there's lots of little things that people can start to reimagine their businesses. So if you're going to have a bar and a hotel in the current environment, can you have the best bar and the best hotel that people actually want to go to in the environment that they're currently living in, when there is a craving for safety and security for both employees and staff and customers? So I think people need to start thinking differently. They need to look at their sales channels, where their income is coming from. You know, we've seen a huge switch into the online channels. They're going to need to look at their logistics channels in terms of how they're actually getting their supplies, which can apply across the board. They're going to need to look at their staff safety. You know, they're going to look at the agility kind of factors, as in, you know, how can you manage a large scale event? You know, we won't have football matches going on in stadiums, but if we can allow 100 people in a pub, can you run a pub with 100 people in it and have a great event? So maybe there is things that are going to evolve, that people will be able to capture the market that is going to be available. And I think the real issue here is to actually start planning in the environment that we're actually in, and be agile enough to change very quickly if necessary, if that market changes and as the market plays along. And the best place to look for the examples is to look abroad. There have been plenty of countries that are already coming out of this and that have gone through pandemics before. And there are cities the size of Waterford there, where there are businesses who have adapted and have grown. So there are models there to follow. So if I was that hotel bar owner, that's what I'd be looking for. I'd be looking to see, how did somebody else do it? And how do you actually progress into the new environment and capitalize on it, not try to kind of just say, oh God, this is dreadful, how am I going to achieve it? And the financial supports are out there to do that at the moment, if it's necessary to get the restocking and that in place. You know, so I would be looking at that as an opportunity rather than looking at it as something that's a potential threat at the moment.
Yeah, I'd agree.
On that, I agree with Aidan, he's 100% right. Everyone has to look at their business a different way. The point I'm making is to have the mindset to do that. You have to get when I was a young entrepreneur, or when I was an entrepreneur, it's the mindset of getting the application of the way the business is going to be different going forward. That's the important bit. Getting thinking and dreaming it up is one thing, and we are going to have to look at our business different, but having the motivation and the mindset to get yourself up and do that, that's the hard bit as well.
Look, it's lovely to finish this off on a very positive note, and you're absolutely right. There are greater opportunities to improve our offering. So please, I'd encourage everyone to embrace that. So thanks again to David, to Ger, and to Aidan. And if anyone has any particular topics they wish us to cover in our webinars, please don't hesitate to get in touch. We're continuing to work remotely, but please don't hesitate to reach out if we can be of any assistance whatsoever. And in the meantime, please keep safe. Thank you very much. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.